My name is Tamara, and today I'm here to talk to you about precursors and impacts of substance use disorder, how vulnerable populations are created, perpetuated, and their relation to public health problems. So, I drafted a theory recently, and the idea is essentially this. Barriers to access of knowledge and resources among vulnerable individuals lead to generational repetition of maladaptive response to personal problems, which entrench the continuity of social problems and cyclically further individual recidivism. Common knowledge as a colloquialism either isn't common or is not evidence-based to a suitable frequency with the necessary widespread implementation across scale for the betterment of individuals, family systems, and societies. Further, knowledge and resources to implement best practice regarding personal problems or life stage changes is alarmingly inaccessible to individuals and families. So, these things, in parallel, tandem, or tangentially, impact populations and their ability to achieve high-value sustainability within our current systems and our authoritative structures, right? This defective operation affects populations generationally in a variety of biological, psychological, and social manners. So, the culmination of each of these things, each of these elements, position at risk vulnerable individuals to have faulty premises for building their own family systems, capable of fostering optimal health and wellness in their children and themselves. So the resulting output is generational repetition of personal problems, which expand to become social problems and have negative impacts on the spheres of sustainability across scale, society, environment, and the economy. So if the theory that I drafted offers an explanation to these things, right, I needed an example. And so that's exactly what I did. I felt as though substance use disorder is one of the best examples of the debate on personal versus social problems. Who's responsible, what causes it, and why can't we seem to treat it? So, a couple of things. The theory itself provides an explanation for how personal problems left either insufficiently or wholly unaddressed with adequate intervention and definitely deficient prevention maturate from the individual across scale to families and then outward to subcultures and populations. And this creates problems for societies. It increases causal factors with each cycle and subsequent generation. So it was intended that by assessing these elements empirically through the background study for the theory, as well as the primary research contained here, that it'll be clear the absolute necessity to identify and protect or treat vulnerable people, so as to eliminate or greatly reduce the elements which generate and perpetuate disease societies, and subsequently reduce the impact on current systems by potentiation of new systems, perhaps, grounded in evidence-based practice, to implement strategies for clear and consistent information, as well as provision of necessary harm reduction and intervention. So it's important to define substance use disorder first, right? The American Psychiatric Association defines substance use disorder, or SUD, in the DSM-5 as a combination of substance abuse and substance dependence into a single disorder measured on a continuum from mild to severe. Another important thing to define here are co-occurring disorders, which, for the purposes of this study, you could consider a co-occurring disorder anything else that's included in the DSM-5, right? So it's going to be the inclusion of one disorder and then the inclusion of another. It could be perhaps depression and substance use disorder. Maybe it's depression and anxiety and substance use disorder, and the ultimate question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. We'll get into that too, though. It's also relevant to define adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood experiences are essentially negative shock impacts, traumatic events, things that happen to individuals during age ranges of plasticity, high plasticity, where you're still forming your cognition, your metabolic, biological, psychological processes. They're all still developing. So that would be pretty bad, right? To have an adverse childhood experience during a time when you're still building all of these things, when you're still building the processes that take your input and generate an output. And then what does that do to your output? So we look at a couple of those things. The purpose of this particular study, the primary research, is to test the presence of the elements which have been previously empirically studied as factors which increase the societal and personal problems of criminal recidivism, relapse, and increase the potentiation across generations, repetition, if you will, for adverse childhood experiences, substance use disorder, and co-occurring disorder in those future generations, probably by societal systems which have failed at treatment in meaningful ways to prevent these from occurring or to limit their effects. So, a couple more things to think about. Barriers in accessing basic needs and resources to treat personal problems exist for populations that are inherently vulnerable. That's what makes them vulnerable. Well, it's one of the many things that probably makes them vulnerable and in turn creates social. So again, these barriers are generational and systemic in nature, which affect an individual's perspective, ability to secure their basic needs, and leads to furthering recidivism and repetition of personal and social problems through the definitions of substance use disorder, co-occurring disorders, and ACEs. So what did I do? I took 22 surveys, and, well, I took a lot of surveys, but 22 of them were completed by patients receiving treatment for substance use disorder at Praxis by Landmark Recovery in Louisville, Kentucky. Patients were read the invitation to participate, and then they were given a study information sheet if they agreed to participate. So then they were taken, if they wanted to have an online survey, self-reporting, to complete that was comprised of 7 blocks or 7 different types of questions to collect demographic information, assess accessibility, basic needs, criminal background, family structure, and address potential, if we can say after going over our definitions, empirically based elements which are considered predictors for substance use disorder, recidivism, and relapse. On to the results. The first question block was demographic information. The majority of the sample population of the 22 patients were between the ages of 31 and 40, white, single and never married, and making under $19,999 yearly, and Christian. The second question block addressed these co-occurring disorders. The majority of patients sampled reported a co-occurring disorder, along with the substance use disorder, such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, just to name a few. The majority reported that they were between the ages of 5 and 10 years old when they were first diagnosed by a medical professional with a disorder other than SUD. Again, which came first, the chicken or the egg? The majority of participants reported that they had received some combination of medication and therapies for their co-occurring disorders, but it had been inconsistent. Among the patients surveyed, 64.29% reported that their families or themselves had trouble paying for their therapies and medications. The majority of patients reported multiple diagnoses of co-occurring disorders, not including substance use disorder. An example of the COD assessment block would be that a patient has been formally diagnosed by a professional, likely from before the age of 10, with, let's say, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and their family was unable to pay for medications and therapies. Therefore, their treatment prior to substance use disorder treatment, or perhaps the development of substance use disorder, were inconsistent. The third block assessed criminal background, and many elements of substance use disorder are criminalized in society. The majority of patients have been charged with a crime, 72.27%, and the majority have been convicted of a crime, 71.43%. Half of patients reported that they felt their charges or convictions had hindered their ability to get housing or work. Only 27.78% felt their charges or convictions had no impact, and 5.56% reported never having been convicted nor charged with a crime. The majority of patients surveyed reported that their inclusion or involvement with the criminal justice system affected their family dynamic. We're not talking in a good way, as you can suspect. This would be the loss of parental rights, divorce or separation, or removal of their children from the family home. The majority of participants were unaware of social programs to reintegrate, such as vocational rehabilitation, and 72.22% of participants did not feel that they were treated humanely during their time involved with the Department of Justice or the Department of Corrections. The fourth block addressed accessibility for individuals. Half of participants reported being able to expect receipt of some sort of assistance in meeting their basic needs from families. So that would be securing food, medical care, housing, or employment. The main concern for participants was an inability to secure employment, followed by housing insecurity, and then insecurity in interpersonal relationships. The majority of participants reported little concern in their ability to get enough to eat, have clothing, toiletries, or household items, the basics. They reported being, quote, not concerned or anxious. So 35.71% of participants did report having trouble finding providers for treatment, and 14.29% did not have trouble finding a provider, but due to some sort of barrier such as insurance, availability, financial or transportation limitations, or even practitioner limitations, those individuals were not able to retain services for treatment. Half of participants reported no trouble finding a provider for treatment. Just half. At this particular facility, Praxis, 54.55% of participants felt that they had access to relationship building skills, parenting courses, family therapies, and the support that they needed for reintegration and successful reentry to society. 13.64% were unsure. The fifth question block addressed patients' ability to meet their basic needs as adults prior to and after treatment, as well as addressing whether their needs were met as children. Remember, the idea is that this is generational. Let's take a look. The sixth question block addressed family size. The majority of patients had children. The majority had at least 2 children. The majority of participants' oldest children were under the age of 18. The majority of each family was comprised of multiple children in age ranges of high plasticity, if not all of the children. The study was performed on this population in particular, or rather the site was chosen because, again, it is one of the only established, out of a whopping 2, facilities, at least that I know of, so I could be wrong. But they're the only ones that offer multimodal treatment for substance use disorder. You know, the ones actually proven to work. And they include comprehensive treatment for these co-occurring disorders, ACEs, and family therapies. And they address things which are empirically considered precursors for substance use disorder, as well as predictors of relapse and criminal recidivism. So, let's discuss. Barriers in accessing basic needs and resources to treat personal problems exist for these populations that are inherently vulnerable, and this in turn creates social problems. These barriers are generational and systemic in nature. They affect an individual's perspective, ability to secure their basic needs, and lead to the furthering recidivism and repetition of personal and social problems of substance use disorder, co-occurring disorders, and ACEs. The results demonstrated the definitions in the background and introduction that I talked about. They displayed perfectly that these individuals have experienced trauma, they have some sort of co-occurring disorder, they have something along the line that probably could have prevented where they were by the time they took the survey, or at least lessen the impact. Maybe there's another way, right? So though the results demonstrated these definitions, and the primary research with the patients receiving treatment at a substance use disorder facility provides a study population that's representative of the factors discussed in the generational components of adverse childhood experiences, the potentiation for co-occurring disorders, and also speaks to the criminality of their actualization. One of the limitations of my study, though, were the small sample size in relation to other studies, such as those conducted in less detail concerning the interconnectedness of co-occurring disorders, substance use disorder, and ACEs, or the ones that only address mental disorder as a broad term, such as those by the Bureau of Prisons. That's another chat for another day, maybe. So a staggering number of populations, inmates, in the Bureau of Prison studies meet the diagnostic criteria for a mental disorder, but their studies state that those in the statistics and figures do not include those being held in mental facilities. It's unclear why incarcerated persons that fit the diagnostic criteria are held in correctional facilities other than treatment facilities. Further consideration for limitations in my study, for example, would be the delicate or volatile physical, mental, and emotional condition of those sampled. So there are always limitations when it comes to self-reporting. How accurate is it? So that's one potential limitation. However, personal problems in this way, I feel, demonstrated by the study, such as criminality, accessibility, some of these things are pretty objective. I do have to say, though, that personal problems demonstrated in that way, such as the criminality, accessibility, extrapolation of family problems, potentiation for trauma, and discussions on mental illness expand to social problems and public health concerns. These are things that a lot of folks are already taking a look at. But what are they doing to fix it? Those afflicted with substance use disorder are what appears to be participating in a way to essentially self-medicate these untreated ACEs, co-occurring disorders, due to inaccessibility most likely based on the data. Trauma and mental illnesses, they're treating those too, but they're doing it themselves, is essentially what this is telling me. These are the same individuals that end up finding themselves struggling to retain housing, employment, and medical care, something that not only makes the situation worse, but can also be considered a precursor for recidivism and relapse. Again, which came first, the chicken or the egg? So you have to say that when we fail to address substance use disorder, its underlying causes, co-occurring disorders, adverse childhood experiences, and mental health concerns, the things that underlie substance use disorder, we're also exposing the next generation to faulty premises of unmet needs, and the children of substance use disorder sufferers should probably be considered inherently vulnerable, high-risk populations. So when this cycle is repeated across generations and families within communities, there exists an inherent connection to specific public health issues, and it has economic implications. People are unable to find work and participate in the economy in meaningful ways. When they're unable to participate in society, chicken and the egg. Individuals are more likely to revert back to behaviors which remove them from society, and the cycle continues. They're also at a higher risk for contagious or communicable diseases if you prefer, as well as age-related diseases. Think cardiopulmonary disease, hepatitis C, HIV. The substance use disorder community is rampant with suffering from these diseases as well. So the study measured exactly what it intended to measure. The results and illustrations in this study definitely compare to works that represent key ideas. The things that we talk about, that these are all interconnected, and they have to be viewed and treated as interconnected. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation today, and I'm willing to leave my email to anyone who wants it, and will remain open for communication if anyone has questions. I may add a couple of extra clips to go into some detail on the appendices that I included in the work. I felt like it was important to go into a little more detail and to pull some things from my theory when we talk about things like ACEs, plasticity, substance use disorder, and the criminality of these things. I'm not saying that any one way is right or wrong, but I am saying that as a scientist doing the primary research on the topic, I have to ask empirical questions, and I get empirical data. It's not a moral argument, it's just taking a look at the empirical factors that have been shown or demonstrated, to contribute to this problem, and what are the things that empirically lessen the impact of the problem, whether that's for individual persons, their families, society at large. The point is, empirical answers to these empirical problems, they do exist, and there may be some questions that still need to be asked. So, if you have any, feel free to shoot them my way, and I'll do my best. Or maybe we can do something together. Thanks.